Easter Sunday had always been a big day for our family. There were hardly any other occasions during the year when the entire family gathered under one roof. This time was no different. To keep the tradition alive, we were all meeting at my Aunt Marlene's house. Her home was in a quiet American suburb in Ohio. There was a large green lawn in front, a white wooden fence, and soft yellow lamps hanging from the porch. When I turned my car into her street, I could already tell from a distance that almost everyone had arrived. The driveway was already full. My uncle's black SUV, my cousin Eric's old pickup truck, and my brother's silver sedan were parked one behind the other. A few cars were also parked along the side of the road. I slowly pulled my car to the curb and sat there for a few seconds. Light from the house windows spilled outside. Every now and then the door opened and closed, and laughter from inside the house drifted all the way out. Everything looked completely normal. But inside my chest there was a strange feeling, like something was going to happen today that had never happened before. I shook my head, pushing the thought away, grabbed my bag, and walked toward the house. The moment I opened the door, warm air and the smell of food wrapped around me. The scent of ham baking in the oven, fresh bread, and mashed potatoes filled the entire house. In the living room, my cousins were laughing loudly while arguing about some joke. Near the TV, my uncle stood talking about an old football game. In the kitchen, my mom and Aunt Marlene were setting the plates. "Oh, you're here," my cousin Lisa said the moment she saw me, smiling as she pulled me into a hug. I smiled back, but my eyes quickly drifted to the other corner of the room. My father was standing there. Normally, at gatherings like this, he was one of the most talkative people in the room. Cracking jokes with everyone, laughing loudly, that was just his nature. But today he looked different. He was standing quietly, carefully observing every person in the room, almost as if he were waiting for the right moment. That small change might not have been noticeable to anyone else, but I noticed it. A little while later, everyone was called into the dining room. The long wooden table had already been set. Plates were arranged neatly over white tablecloth, and colorful Easter eggs decorated the center of the table. We all took our seats. For a few minutes, normal conversation continued. Some people talked about work, others about school, and some about their vacation plans. Then suddenly my father placed his glass on the table. The sound was soft, but it carried through the room. He pushed his chair back slightly and cleared his throat. Slowly, the conversations began to fade. Everyone's eyes turned toward him. And then he said that he had something important to tell the whole family. In that moment, for the first time, I felt my heart start beating faster. Because the way he was looking at me, it was clear that this wasn't going to be just about the family house. And what he was about to say in the next few seconds turned that Easter dinner into something none of us would ever forget. My father stood there silently for a few seconds. The entire room had gone completely quiet. The light chatter that had filled the air earlier had slowly faded away. Now every single pair of eyes was on him. He rested his fingers lightly on the edge of the table, as if carefully choosing his words. "I just want to make a small announcement," he said calmly. At that, a few people smiled and nodded. In our family, small announcements at gatherings weren't unusual. Sometimes it was news about a new job, sometimes someone buying a house. But there was something different about the way my father was speaking. There was a strange seriousness in his voice. He looked around the room, as if making sure everyone was paying attention. Then he said, "As you all know, the old family house has always been special to us." Several people immediately nodded in agreement. It was the house where my grandparents had lived. The house where we spent our childhood vacations. The house connected to almost every family memory we had. My father continued, "For quite some time, I've been thinking about what should be done with that house." My brother leaned back in his chair with a faint smile, as if he already had an idea of what was coming next. I didn't. I simply sat there quietly, tracing my fingers around the rim of my glass. Then my father delivered the decision. "I've decided that the house will now officially be transferred to Jason." Jason, my brother. For a few seconds, there was a light silence in the room. Then 2 or 3 people smiled and said things like, "Well, that's good." My aunt nodded happily. My uncle added, "Yes, that's a wise decision." My brother was now openly smiling. But I was still trying to process what had just happened. For me, the decision was completely unexpected. Not because the house was being given to him, but because no one had ever even talked to me about it. I slowly glanced toward my mother, but she avoided my eyes and focused on her plate. Then my father cleared his throat again. "And there's one more thing," he said. The room fell silent once again. This time his eyes stopped directly on me. In that moment, I suddenly felt my heart beating faster than before. Because the way he was looking at me, there was something strange about it. Something that had never been there before. He leaned slightly forward in his chair and looked straight at me. Then he said the sentence that made every single person in the room fall completely silent. "To be honest," he said slowly, "this decision was easier, because you were never really part of this family." For a few seconds, I couldn't hear anything. It felt as if the entire room had suddenly drifted far away. The people sitting around me had become completely still. No one said a word. No one even tried to move. And then my father added another sentence. A sentence that made the silence even heavier. Looking straight at me, he said, "If you want to know the truth, ask your mother." In that moment, every face in the room had changed. But none of them realized that the real story hadn't even begun yet. Because a few seconds later, the sound of a chair scraping against the floor was about to echo through the room. My father's words seemed to hang in the air. "If you want to know the truth, ask your mother." For a few seconds, it felt as if every person in the room had forgotten how to breathe. There was no sound. No clinking of dishes, no shifting of chairs, not even a cough. Just a heavy, uncomfortable silence. I stayed seated in my chair, as if my body had suddenly stopped working. My hands were still resting on the table, but it felt like they didn't even belong to me anymore. Slowly, my eyes moved toward my mother. She wasn't even looking at me. Her eyes were fixed on her plate, as if something on it had suddenly become extremely interesting. In that moment, something inside me felt like it was breaking. I quietly said, "Dad, what are you talking about?" My voice was as quiet as the silence in the room. My father shrugged, as if he had simply said something ordinary. "I'm saying what's true," he replied calmly. Across the table, my cousin Lisa looked at me. The question in her eyes was probably the same one everyone in the room was thinking. But no one spoke. My brother Jason, who had been smiling just minutes earlier, was now completely silent. His hands were clasped together, and he was staring down at the table. I looked at my mother again. This time she slowly lifted her head. Our eyes met, just for a moment. And in that single moment, I thought I saw a brief flash of fear on her face. But the very next second, she looked away again. My heart started beating even faster. "Mom," I said softly. She didn't answer. My father let out a quiet breath, as if none of this was bothering him at all. "Look," he said, "I thought it was time for the truth to come out." A few people at the table shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. My uncle picked up his glass and drank some water, as if he had suddenly become very thirsty. But no one dared to say anything. My father looked straight at me and said, "You've always believed you were part of this family." He paused for a moment before continuing. "But the truth is, you never were." This time, his words felt even heavier. I couldn't even understand what I was feeling. Anger, shame, or just emptiness. It felt as if the ground beneath my feet was slowly disappearing. Every person sitting in that room was now looking either at me, or at my mother. As if everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. And then, the soft sound of a chair scraping against the floor broke the silence. Every head in the room turned in that direction. At the other end of the table, my grandmother, Grandma Helen, was slowly rising from her chair. She was nearly 80 years old, and normally she spoke very little during gatherings like this. But this time, there was a different seriousness on her face. She looked once at my father, then at me, and then, without saying a word, she reached for her purse. In that moment, my heart started racing again. Because the way she opened her purse, it looked like she had known all along that this was going to happen. And when she reached inside, for the first time, I realized that maybe The truth wasn't what my father had just claimed. And a few seconds later, the entire room was about to find out what the real truth was. Grandma Helen slowly stood up from her chair. She was nearly 80 years old, so whenever she stood up, someone usually rushed to help her. But this time, no one dared to move. The same heavy silence still filled the room. My father's eyes were now fixed on her. There was a faint look of surprise on his face, as if he hadn't expected anyone to stand up. Without rushing, Grandma opened her old leather purse. It was the same brown purse I had seen since I was a child. Every family gathering, every holiday, every celebration, she always carried that same purse. But in that moment, it suddenly felt very important. Grandma reached inside. Every person at the table was now watching that single movement. My father slightly furrowed his brow. "Mom, what are you doing?" he asked, sounding a little uneasy. Grandma didn't even look at him. She simply kept searching inside her purse. A few seconds later, her fingers stopped on something. Then she slowly pulled it out. It was an old envelope. The paper had turned slightly yellow, and the edges were a little bent. It clearly wasn't new. It looked like something that had been carefully kept safe for a very long time. The people in the room leaned forward slightly, watching even more closely. My father's eyes locked onto the envelope. "What is that?" he asked, his voice a little sharper now. For the first time, Grandma looked directly at him. Her eyes carried the same calm determination I had always seen in them. Holding the envelope with both hands, she slowly said, "Something that should have come to light a long time ago." Her voice wasn't loud, but every person in the room heard her words clearly. My father's face tightened slightly. "Mom, this isn't the right time for this," he said. But Grandma acted as if she hadn't heard him at all. She looked at me. Suddenly, there was a strange softness in her eyes. Then she placed the envelope in the center of the table. It made a soft sound as it touched the surface. But in that moment, that small sound felt like it echoed across the entire room. My heart started racing again. I had no idea what could possibly be inside that envelope. But the way my father was staring at it, it was clear that he recognized it. For the first time, my mother also lifted her head. The moment her eyes landed on that envelope, the color drained slightly from her face. And then Grandma quietly said, "I've kept this safe for 25 years. At those words, a faint stir passed through the room. Someone quietly inhaled. Someone tightened their grip on their chair. My father's eyes had now turned completely serious. 25 years. My uncle repeated softly. Grandma nodded. Then she looked at me and said, "Maybe today is the right time for everyone to learn the truth." My hands unknowingly tightened around the edge of the table. Because in that moment, I realized something for the first time. That envelope wasn't just some old piece of paper. It was something that could change the entire story of this room. And most of all, my father's. Grandma's words seemed to linger in the room. "I've kept this for 25 years. The moment she said it, the air in the room seemed to grow heavier. No one moved. No one spoke. Every pair of eyes was fixed on the old yellow envelope now lying in the center of the dining table. Without realizing it, I tightened my fingers around the edge of the table. My father was still standing, but the confident firmness on his face from earlier was gone. His eyes kept drifting back to the envelope, as if he already suspected what might be inside it. "Mom," he finally said, "there's no need to do all this right now." His voice was a little sharper than before. But Grandma Helen looked at him calmly. "I think it's already far too late," she said quietly. My uncle shifted slightly in his chair. My cousin Lisa's eyes had widened with curiosity. My brother Jason was completely silent now, his gaze lowered toward the table. And my mother. She was still sitting perfectly still. But her hands were trembling slightly. Grandma gently pushed the envelope forward with her fingers. "You just said that this girl was never part of this family," she said to my father. A faint rustle moved through the room. My father's face hardened slightly. "I said what's true," he replied coldly. Grandma looked at him for a few seconds. Then she spoke in a calm but very clear voice. "Then maybe today we should also see what the real truth is." As she said this, She reached for the envelope. For the first time, I felt my breathing grow slightly faster. Because the way Grandma held that envelope, it felt as though it contained more than just paper. It felt like an old story was hidden inside it. She slowly opened the edge of the envelope. The soft sound of paper echoed through the room. And at that exact moment, my mother's fork slipped from her hand. The metal made a small sound as it hit the table, then clinked against the plate before falling to the floor. Clink! The sound seemed unusually loud in the silence of the room. Everyone's attention immediately turned toward my mother. Her face had suddenly gone very pale. My father looked at her as well. "What's wrong?" he asked, sounding slightly uneasy. But my mother didn't answer. She was just staring at the opened envelope, as if she already knew what was inside it. And maybe that was exactly why her hands were shaking. Grandma slowly pulled the paper out of the envelope. It was a folded document. White paper, though its edges looked slightly aged. She hadn't even fully opened it yet when my father's voice suddenly cut through the silence again. This time, it wasn't calm. "Mom, that's enough," he said. But without even looking at him, Grandma replied, "No, not today." Then she held the paper with both hands and slowly began unfolding it. At that moment, it felt as though every person in the room was holding their breath. Because whatever was written on that paper in the next few seconds might change the entire story of this family. And most of all, my father's. Grandma fully unfolded the old paper. The light from the lamp above the table fell directly on it, making the words written on it clearly visible. But no one had read them out loud yet. Everyone in the room was simply staring at the document, including me. I had no idea what was written there. But my heart was beating so fast that I could actually hear it in my ears. Grandma slowly adjusted her glasses. Then she lifted the paper slightly and looked at me. Her eyes held the same calm determination I had seen in them since childhood. "Today, something very serious was said in this family," she said softly. No one responded. My father was standing perfectly still now. The muscles in his face were tight, as if he were trying hard to remain calm. Grandma continued. "It was said that this girl was never part of this family." Some people sitting at the table exchanged uncomfortable glances. Then Grandma gestured toward the document. "So maybe it's time we also see what the real truth is." She lowered the paper slightly and began to read. "This is a medical record," she said. The moment she said that, a faint whisper moved through the room. "A medical record." I frowned slightly. Grandma continued reading. 25 years ago, when this child was born, an official test was conducted at the hospital. My father immediately tried to interrupt. "Mom, that's all old news." But without even looking at him, Grandma said, "Please let me finish." Her voice wasn't loud, but there was such firmness in it that my father fell silent. The heavy silence returned to the room. Grandma looked back at the document. The purpose of this test was to confirm paternity. A strange knot formed in my stomach. Now everyone in the room was listening with complete attention. Grandma quietly read the next line. "And according to this report." She paused for a moment and looked at the paper again. Then she lifted her head and looked directly at my father. Her voice was clearer than before. "According to this report, the biological father of this child, her real father, is you." Several sharp breaths filled the room at once. It sounded as if multiple people had inhaled at the exact same moment. My father's face suddenly went completely rigid. "That's nonsense," he said immediately. But the confidence in his voice was gone. Grandma placed the document on the table. "This is an official hospital record," she said calmly. My mother was still sitting silently, but tears were now shining in her eyes. My brother Jason slowly lifted his head and, for the first time, looked directly at my father. The rest of the people in the room were now glancing at one another, as if they no longer knew what to say. And in the middle of that heavy silence, I realized something for the first time. My father hadn't proven anything yet. But the paper Grandma had placed on the table had suddenly thrown his entire story into question. And this was only the beginning. Because there was still one more line written on that document. A line Grandma hadn't read yet. The silence in the room had grown even heavier than before. Grandma's words still seemed to float in the air. The biological father of this child is you. My father stood there for a few seconds. The confidence he had just minutes earlier was now completely gone. But then he suddenly shook his head. That's wrong, he said. His voice was slightly louder now. You can't prove anything just by pulling out some old piece of paper. He reached toward the table, as if he wanted to grab the document and look at it. But Grandma pulled the paper back toward herself before he could touch it. You don't need to look at it, she said calmly. My father frowned. Why? He asked. Grandma replied without hesitation. Because you already know what it says. A faint stir moved through the room again. My uncle sat up straighter in his chair and said, Helen, what exactly is going on here? Grandma slowly lifted the paper again. I haven't even read the most important part yet, she said. My heart started racing again. For the first time, I realized that my hands were actually trembling. Grandma looked down at the paper and paused for a moment before reading the next line. Then she said, there is also a note from the doctor at the bottom of this report. Everyone in the room was now completely focused on her. My father's eyes narrowed. What note? He asked in a harsher tone. Grandma lifted the paper slightly. The doctor wrote that this test was conducted because the father himself requested it. My father's face suddenly tightened, as if something he had kept hidden for years had just been dragged into the light. Grandma continued reading, and after the results came back, the father requested the hospital to keep the record private. The expressions on people's faces around the table began to change. My uncle quietly said, Wait, does that mean? But he couldn't finish the sentence. Because by that moment, everyone in the room had begun to understand. Grandma lowered the paper. Then she looked straight into my father's eyes. 25 years ago, she said quietly, you were the one who asked for this test. My father immediately replied, because I had doubts. His voice echoed across the room, and the report clearly showed that. But he suddenly stopped, as if he had just realized what he was about to say. Everyone in the room fell completely silent. My brother Jason spoke for the first time. Dad, if the report showed that, then why did you just say she wasn't part of this family? The question was direct and simple. My father looked at him, but he didn't have an immediate answer. And in that moment, I realized something for the first time. Maybe this story wasn't over yet. Because Grandma quietly said, the real reason, no one knows yet. Her words echoed through the room before slowly settling into silence. The real reason, no one knows yet. For a few seconds, no one even moved. I looked at my father. His face no longer looked as firm as before. It seemed as though someone had suddenly drained all the strength out of him. My brother Jason was still staring at him. Dad, you didn't answer, he said quietly. There was no anger in his voice, just a simple question. My father took a deep breath. Then he turned his gaze away from the table and looked toward the window, as if thinking. But the rest of the people in the room were no longer willing to wait. My uncle said, if the report clearly says she's your daughter, then why did you say something like that in front of everyone? My father didn't answer immediately. A few seconds later, he slowly pulled a chair back and sat down. It was the first time he had sat during the entire dinner. He placed his hands on the table and intertwined his fingers. Because, he began. But then he stopped. The heavy silence returned to the room once again. My mother finally lifted her head. Tears were now clearly visible in her eyes. Because she deserved to know the truth, my father finally said. I frowned. What truth? I asked. My voice was quiet, but now it held more confusion than fear. For the first time, my father looked directly at me. The hardness that had been in his eyes earlier was gone. Now there was only exhaustion. The truth is, he said slowly, that 25 years ago, when you were born, I wasn't sure you were my daughter. A faint rustle moved through the room again. But this time no one looked surprised, because Grandma had already made that part clear. My father continued. That's why I had that test done. He gestured toward the paper lying on the table. When the report came back, I found out that you were my daughter. Hearing that, a strange mixture of relief and anger rose inside me. Then why just now? I asked. My father didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned his gaze toward my mother. My mother was sitting completely still now. Everyone in the room slowly turned to look at her. For a few seconds, no one said anything. Then my father quietly said, "Because after that test, I discovered another truth." The moment he said that, my heart began pounding again. "What truth?" my uncle asked. My father stayed silent for a moment before answering. "At that time, your mother was seeing someone else too." My mother's eyes closed immediately, as if she wanted to escape that moment. The shock on the faces around the table was impossible to miss. My father continued. "I didn't say anything back then, because the report proved that you were my daughter." He took a deep breath. "But today, when the subject of the house came up, I felt that maybe everyone should know the truth." The heavy silence returned to the room again. But this time, the atmosphere felt different. Because now every pair of eyes in the room was on my mother. And I could feel it. The story was probably about to take another turn. The silence in the room had grown even heavier than before. The moment my father finished speaking, everyone's eyes turned toward my mother. She was still sitting in her chair, both hands tightly clasped together under the table. For a few seconds, she didn't lift her head. Then slowly, she took a deep breath. And for the first time that evening, she began to speak. "You've only told half the truth," she said in a calm but tired voice. My father immediately looked at her. "Half?" he asked. My mother lifted her head and looked directly into his eyes. Her eyes were still moist, but her voice sounded steadier now. "Yes, half," she repeated. Everyone in the room had gone completely silent. My uncle leaned slightly forward in his chair, as if he were about to hear something very important. My mother spoke slowly. "You told everyone that you had doubts." She paused briefly before continuing. "But you didn't tell them why you had those doubts." My father's face hardened slightly. "That's not necessary," he said immediately. But my mother shook her head. "Today it is," she replied calmly. The people in the room were listening even more carefully now. My mother slowly looked at me. There was guilt in her eyes, and a glimpse of some old pain. Then she looked away from me and back at my father. "Tell her," she said. My father remained silent for a few seconds. Then he let out a small laugh, but there was no joy in it. "Fine," he said. He rotated the glass on the table slightly before speaking again. 25 years ago, your mother and I were going through a difficult time." My heart started beating faster again. "We fought constantly," he said. "Sometimes because of money, sometimes because of work, and sometimes simply because we were both angry with each other." My uncle and aunt glanced at each other. Perhaps they had never known this before. My father continued. "One night, the argument got so bad that I left the house." He paused for a few seconds and took a breath. "I didn't come back for almost 3 months." A faint stir moved through the room. My brother Jason lifted his head and, for the first time, began listening with complete attention. My father continued. "When I finally came back, I found out that your mother was pregnant." Shock spread across the faces around the table. My father looked at me. And in that moment, I thought maybe the child wasn't mine. It felt as if someone had placed a cold stone in my stomach. Everyone in the room had become completely still. My mother quietly said, "But you still had the test done." My father nodded. "Yes," he said. "And the report clearly showed that the child was mine." He looked toward the document lying on the table. Then he said slowly, "But after that day, the doubt in my mind never completely disappeared." The silence returned once again. And in that silence, I realized something for the first time. This story wasn't just about a test report or an envelope. It was a story about trust that had been broken 25 years ago. And maybe, its ending still hadn't come. After my father's last words, the same deep silence returned to the room. No one spoke. It felt as though every person sitting at that dining table was thinking the same thing. How could a doubt survive for 25 years? My father was still sitting in his chair. His hands rested on the table, and his eyes were fixed somewhere on the floor. My mother slowly took a breath. Then she said, "You had doubts, and I can understand that." Her voice was calm now. "But you also received an answer." She pointed toward the old document lying on the table. "That report clearly said she was your daughter." My father said nothing. The rest of the people in the room also remained silent. My brother Jason slowly nodded, as if he too was trying to process everything. My mother continued. "And yet you carried that doubt inside you for 25 years, and today you presented it in front of everyone as if it were the truth." There was no anger in her voice, only exhaustion. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then Grandma Helen slowly picked up the envelope and placed it back inside her purse. She looked at me. There was a softness in her eyes. "Some truths come out late," she said. "But that doesn't make them any less true." I took a deep breath. In that moment, for the first time, I felt the fear inside me slowly fading. Because now the truth was out. My father finally lifted his head. He looked at me. For a few seconds, he couldn't say anything. Then he quietly said, "Maybe. I shouldn't have said it that way." It wasn't an apology, but it was the first time there was a hint of regret in his voice. The people around the table slowly began breathing again. Someone picked up a glass of water. Someone shifted in their chair. And little by little, the heavy silence began to break. Easter dinner would never be the same as it once was. But that night, one thing became clear. Sometimes the truth arrives late. But when it does, it takes many misunderstandings away with it. And maybe, sometimes a family has to face the truth all over again. If you found this story interesting and you enjoy hearing real-life stories like this, be sure to like the video. And if you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe and press the bell icon so you don't miss the next story. And one more thing, tell me in the comments, if you were in my place, what would you have done at that dining table?